challenging talk, which I think is one of the best ways of entering into the space of true transdisciplinary questions concerning the topic of our conference, because it goes beyond and further into the questions than by just saying that there are different perspectives on things, perspectives coming from psychology, perspectives coming from history, and perspectives coming from literature, which I think is not the best way of going about transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary research. I think it involves the putting into questions of conflated terms that are being conflated normally, like the differentiation you made at the end, which I find very important between testimony and discourse. And there are other destinies of that which is also a destiny in discourse than in testimony. And it's not the same thing. That I think is crucial. So I would like to take this opportunity to lead over directly to the roundtable, because I think this is the best platform we have for it. And you just stay up here and we'll intertwine it with the discussion. Dori and Moshe, do you want to come up, or do you want to stay there? I think it would be better if you came. We haven't prepared anything. Individually we have prepared something, but we haven't prepared anything as a roundtable. So who would like to start? I mean, I'm also giving up. I'm not chairing this roundtable because I'm part of it. So.
Okay. So actually the idea is just to remind us, the idea is to give some kind of insight, some kind of reflections of what was going on in each and every chair, in every panel, and to maybe we can regain in the short time we have some kind of interactional ideas between the four panels. So who wants to start? Dori? Dori, you were the first of two panels.
I see this as a continuum throughout the conference. And the two morning panels with a lot of clinical presentations. The cases that Ruth Golan presented, a father who refuses testimony and a daughter who then lives it through her anorexia nervosa. And the father has a lot to say. He witnesses the murder of his parents, probably was a skeleton himself, then becomes a pillar of the state of Israel, and that's all he has to say. And it's the whole discourse of heroism we were talking about. And as we saw the transition of the discourse of heroism to the discourse of the affected, I don't want to use the word victim so much, but of pain, so we see intergenerationally that shift from father to daughter, from the discourse of the of heroism to the discourse of pain. And how this juxtaposed to that diary of Eti Hillesum. There is a transformative transition to something beyond, where she, in her diary, she even addresses God. You cannot repair the world. Who can help you repair it? How she, in a way, it resonates with Anna Frank, but I assume that's even more extreme to the extent that how her grasp is to leave that discourse and talk about the repair of the world, Tikkun Olam. I think that the subtext of both cases being about the encounter with, in Lacan's sense, the real, and not quite able to bear testimony to the encounter with the real, because that's not possible. I regret very much that I cannot say much about the Jean-François Chanterotte, because I really don't understand the French, and so. The other paper of Dana Amir about the establishment of the internal witness, and it's a notion I didn't think of, the primary violence of the mother. And this is what she the primal maternal violence, which simply reflects the weakness in the child's total helplessness, and the mother simply giving form. And then what she described in her case, the secondary violence of the mother, and the crucial importance of the presence of the third, the father, or reality. And for me, this was something about the truth that is inherent in testimony. Sorry, there's another third that made its appearance, and I have to silence it. But if it's limited to the dyad only in the infantile sense, there is no witness. And the importance of creating that third that is the witness and guarantees the truth. So it was very much a continuation of the internal dialogue and the creation of a representation and the shifts in the internal dialogue and the shifts in the discourses. A remark on the next two papers, and I want to note how both papers so elegantly presented an unresolved question, when I think the question is not so unresolved. Unjust wars create a more trauma testimony. There are more turmoil. But, it's left as a research question, do they or do they not? Maybe it's totally not causal. Except enough evidence points to be causal. I don't think about what is the final research that will really prove. And similarly, I think that the most compelling presentation of the Yom Kippur War by Zohar, and how the abreactive treatment caused so much recrudescence or so much re-traumatization. And partially it was a certain in the other paper on the internal other on Dana Amir's, it was a certain violence continued on the patients through the forced abreaction, when in fact what was mostly needed was a very gentle holding and allowing for them to emerge from the helplessness of traumatization and become who they are again. But Igor also left it as a maybe an unresolved question. I don't think it's such an unresolved question. We pretty much know that it's quite accepted that that reaction can cause damage. I would like to also maybe close my preliminary remarks with an unresolved question, which is, to what extent does the traumatization continue, or is it to what extent is it reenacted, both through discourses of heroism that enforce silence and are forced discourses, and through discourses of abreaction that are also forced discourses, how unwittingly, unconsciously, the perpetrator, taken in now, continues to act, and how traumatization really doesn't end unless there can be real testimony and witnessing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll stand up. Thanks. It's late and we're tired, so I assume I'm going to provoke a little. I come from a totally different discipline. I'm a historian. I work on 16th, 17th, 18th century French history. I'm working on female mystics and female demoniacs, women are possessed by the devil. But I realize that on some level there is a lot of correlation between the issues that bother me and that I've been thinking about for the last 10, 15 years and the issues that have come up here today, the concerns. And I'll mention two of them. One is the theoretical, the gap between the experience and the narrative. But two, which is both theoretical but I think also moral, which is the issue of the speaking agent. Who is speaking, who has the right to speak, who is speaking to whom, by what authority, and for what purpose. And I think that this whole set of issues, concerns that have bothered me while writing my book, while reading my text, I think in this or that variation have all been played around throughout the day. And I use moral, and Dr. Consoni earlier called for taking into account the moral or ethical, I don't remember exactly the term you used, thinking more about the moral aspect of some of the narratives, and Dori just talked about the violence that is performed, and I will add to it the violence that is performed on the text or on the testimony by the reader. And to move from the general to the concrete, I want to really talk about the two presentations that were presented to us by Professor Tucker and Dr. Rosinski during the panel that I chaired. Shalamov spent 17 years in the Gulag. And while he's writing fiction, his short stories are small vignettes that are based on either his own personal experiences or literary renditions of stories that he heard from other people and he could connect to his own experiences. Huri has been a political activist, a professional author, a literary figure, has never been tortured, has never been imprisoned, and I am asking myself, one, does it matter? Who cares? General. But now I'm moving to the personal. I do care. And I care very much. And I think that not only that I care, but I think that bringing these facts, trivial facts, into the discussion may help us maybe look at some aspects of the text themselves. And I'll say it explicitly, reading Hori, unlike the rest of you, I did know in advance what, I'll call him Iran, what Iran was going to talk about, so I read the book. Hori made me extremely angry. So why did he make me so upset? Hori is a maximalist. Yallo is protagonist, he's a robber, he's a rapist, he's maybe not a traitor, maybe even involved in a gang of bomb makers working for the Israelis. He's a perpetrator of atrocities, as well as their victim. He's a brutalizer of women whose own mother had been traumatized by a brutal event that he's never really made explicit. He's also a third-generation victim of the ongoing Lebanese self-mutilation. His ancestral village, as Liran mentioned to us, had been all by destroyed by the Great Ottoman Massacre of Armenians and the Syriac Christians, to which Hori himself, as well as his protagonist, belong. Hori's novel is, and excuse my French, very French. It is fascinated with the big questions, big, capital B questions, capital Q. And it does it in a very, very French way of connecting violence and blood and sex with the big truths. And again, capital B, capital T. Think Sade, think Bataille, think Jonathan Littell. And of course it is a novel about the biggest literary question of all, the question of writing. As Liran points out, Hori repeatedly forces us to think of the similarities between writing autobiography and writing confession, between the act of writing and the act of killing or self-killing, between writing and death. For Hori, the bedroom is the battlefield, torture and sex are hardly distinguished, words are a failed attempt to find redemption from meaningless, brutal world, and any attempt to cohere a self, even one's own self, is delusional. Everybody is both good and evil. Everybody is both the brutalizer and the brutalized. Every attempt to say something, anything, is always doomed to fail. Or to use the narrator's own words, suddenly Yallo understood that every person carries two souls within him, the first for laughter and the second for weeping, and that everyone's problem is that these two souls work together, which is why people are never able to define their feelings. End of quote. I find this idea, which I think is supposed to pass as profound, extremely banal and extremely wrong. This is pyrotechnics, and Liran gave us another example of confessing during his torture was just like telling the truth to his lover in bed. Sorry, this is silly. Not that Liran is silly, but the claims about truth, about writing, about confession, about victimhood, about everybody is happily floating together in the gray zone in which there is no evil and no good. These ideas are one, pyrotechnics, two, wrong. Pyrotechnics, fireworks turn into ashes. Human beings were turned into ashes. To argue that there is a similarity between these two things is morally unsupportable, even unarguable. If Hori is a maximalist, Shalamov is a minimalist. And he tries, it seems to me, to say as little as possible. And I think that he tries to erase from his narratives even the larger picture that he does know, not to mention all the many things, the hindsights, the context that his characters didn't know at the time. He tries to let latency speak, or rather unspeak. And he leaves it to the reader to make a larger sense of the events that unfold in the stories, and this sense could only be made, if I understand correctly, retroactively by relating recurring motifs to each other and to hindsight and to historical events. As such, the reader's comprehension is always delayed and is always in some sense a space of suspension. And this space of suspension that exists between reading and comprehending, I think is in some way resembles or is similar to the space of the incomprehension that characterized the protagonists themselves at the time of the events. I think that we have here two very, very different ways of representation of horror. I think there are very different ways of negotiating events through text with readers. The third. And I think that this sense of this degree of suspension, this degree of humility, of hesitancy, that I read and that I think characterizes Shalamov's stories, I think this is exactly what is missing, for example, in Hannah Arendt's writing on the Holocaust, and I think this is exactly what I found missing in Huri's novel. I will just I finish what I have to say. I'll just add one little thing. Maybe there is something in the form of the novella or the short story that is more appropriate. I'm thinking Primo Levi, Wiesel, Aaron Appelfeld did a think. Maybe there is something more appropriate in the novella or the short story to tell the first-person experience of horror rather than to get lost in the pyrotechnics. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, our friend Liran, who is not silly at all, indeed, seems to have a special talent, because I remember when he organized the Jonathan Littell conference in Jerusalem, the conference ended up with very much the same debate that you brought up just now. Historians talking in a specific and very understandable way of literature, resorting to more or less moral arguments for literature, and it's very interesting. I find this symptomatic. I mean, it has to do with literature as something that triggers symptomatic reactions, which leads me to one just very general point, which is important to me. I think literature, and much more so, the teaching of literature is a reaction to trauma. It's a cultural reaction to trauma. Literature, there's something in literature that is traumatic per se. The very fact that there is language that can allow itself anything, and that can even be not language, can even be not language in any understandable way, is something structurally traumatic. That does not mean that it relates to a personal trauma in a specific way that you deal with in the clinical field. Although, I would say that speaking from the point of view of a psychoanalyst, I would say that the psychoanalytic experience, which I put into parentheses, because I think it's a very problematic term, psychoanalytic experience, but let's use it. The psychoanalytic experience brings to something in which a very normal and very recurrent and maybe in a certain way indispensable distinctions and concepts, such as the differentiation between individual and society, between language and its other, its referential other, or its communication, or that which is communicated in it, the difference between objective truth and subjective fiction, or whatever you place on the other side, even the difference between past and present, the difference between psyche and its disturbance, all these distinctions and all these concepts do not work. If you are in psychoanalytic experience, you have to do away with them, which is not saying that everything is the same, this is the way you go. It's a very classical move to say, when you come to a point where certain concepts do not work, you assume that the person who says that everything is the same, which is not true, which is not the case. It means that you have to invent, and every time anew, in a certain way, new concepts and new differentiations. And for that, literature, and especially the teaching of literature, is crucial for me. Because in the teaching of literature, you have the same problem. If you teach literature as representation, you are a historian, which is great, but you're not a literary critic. If you teach literature as a representation of something, you're either a sociologist or you're a historian. You miss your discipline, which happens. Which is also a resource, a natural resource for academia. You have to miss your discipline in a certain way in order for there to be productive and creative disciplines. But you have to know, if you talk about literature as a representation, you're not to talk about literature. I don't think that literature per se is in the first place about representation. It is about literature writes, and it thinks, and it even feels in a certain way. It senses, but it does not represent. There is a representational layer and a referential layer in literature that is very important because it comes with language. But we don't have literature in order to have that which comes with language anyway. Otherwise we wouldn't have literature. Literature is a reaction to something other in language for which there are many words, and one of them is trauma, and one of them is testimony. So there is a structural similarity or analogy between literature and psychoanalysis, which is very important, which comes, and this is traumatic for a conference, I think, it comes with the effect of subverting the discourse that is presented, because you can't do otherwise. I don't think that there is any speaking from the point of view of trauma that is not somehow testifying in its being a discourse to the trauma itself. If you speak coherently about trauma and objectively about trauma, scientifically about trauma, you're not speaking about trauma. It's very, very, very obvious. But you need literature not as an illustration, but as a way of hearing differently and thinking differently. So this is a very general point I wanted to make at the end. I'm not referring to any specific paper, but I think it's implicit in what I said. Okay. Yeah.
The only thing that, two things that come to mind. One, that what I said in the conclusion of my paper. One thing I just want to repeat two things. I spoke about the spondee and a response and an echo. So actually three things. One is the sentence that I said at the end of my presentation, which indicates something about my subjective implication in this from a place of trauma. As someone who also, like Marcus, works with literature and is a practicing psychoanalyst. Two, related to three, Marcus said that in his introduction to my paper that he understands why I put into question a profession that I have to do with the profession. Freud called it an impossible profession, psychoanalysis of interruption. So I'm glad to continue to be the silent interruption, especially after what Marcus said right now, to which the only rejoinder that came to my mind, it was in Hebrew, but you understand Hebrew. It's an acronym that says Aleph Mem Lamed, En Ma Losif.
Any remarks, please?
Well, another itself can fully just a little bit. And well, I do agree that it's not homogeneous and there are parts which are some of these phrases that you Sackler are really unique, but some of them are strong. I do want to say something about the gray zone. I think the important thing, I mean, this is something which I think is quite banal, but the important thing is the potential. This is an important claim that, I mean, of course there are perpetrators and there are victims, we all know that, but I think it's exactly the frightening thing that nobody is born a perpetrator and nobody is born a victim, and that the potential for both is in everyone. This is an important claim. What we see, for example, in Yellow is that the victims of one generation become the perpetrators of another, and I think Freud has a message there which concerns, if we become concrete for a moment, the history of Lebanon, where this has been repeated many, many times. People have slaughtered their neighbors throughout the years repeatedly. This is something. This is exactly what is so troublesome with the human potential to become perpetrator. If things were so clear, it would be much less frightening. And of course, this generational thing is also something that can be seen within an individual, that exactly because somebody has been a victim and becomes a perpetrator, psychoanalysis identifies this. Other than that, I do agree with Marcus that literary explorations work differently, and I do see this book as a kind of exploration of these things, and they should be approached, I think, with differently.
Please pass the...
Hello? Yeah, no. I want to say a few words about what Marcus said, if I may, about the idea that terms become differentiated when they don't work. So from a sociological perspective on literary criticism as discourse, I wonder why, although psychology has evolved since Freud, Lacan, Capra, so much of the work on Holocaust cites these people and their theories, and there might be other responses, human responses that fit other models. So I'm just wondering why that hasn't happened if there is differentiation. And also, I would say that there is a kind of reality created by teaching literary criticism and reading literary criticism, just from the field, again, of doing ethnography and the way trauma discourse is creating realities for people who are reading trauma discourse, learning about trauma. So you see patterns where people are speaking about absences that they didn't necessarily experience in that way, about unspeakability in ways that they didn't experience in that way. So then, although I'm a structuralist in my thinking as an anthropologist, and I'm fascinated by the search for isomorphisms, but at the same time, in life, there may be people who don't experience these patterns this way. So I'm just wondering, there's a huge impact. You can now see, as I was saying, culture brokers who are teaching a certain kind of psychology, a certain kind of literary criticism, because it's become all conflated in many places today. This is just the way we think about genocide today in the world. So,
Thank you very much. a small remark about what you said of why Freud or Lacan is cited. I think it's endemic to this conference, not necessarily in the reality, for instance, the clinical reality. I can testify that our notion, and I think Steve will agree with that with me, the notion of trauma is totally different from what Freud phrased or formulated.
I was referring specifically to literary.
Yes, but if I need to, I think I need to put this remark anyway, so I just take a lift on it. And I think it's very important to realize that even for Freud, it was very frustrating for us reading Freud, because I said it in the break, he differentiated between two kinds of trauma, the actual trauma and then psychodynamic trauma. And when he's speaking about actual trauma, it was very short. It appears in very few writings and then disappeared from his writing, and I think quite unfortunate, because what we understand trauma is I think very close to the actual trauma and not the other kind that Freud actually meant. And since then, we have a vast of literature telling us, not only in terms of purely clinical understanding, but in other areas, other disciplines, what trauma is. And I think this is another issue for this conference, but because of short time we cannot debate on it.
Actually, during this afternoon, I think that the question about the specificity of literature in this topic was really a big question for me. It really challenges me. I was trying all the time to find some answers to the question that I had while I was listening most of the lectures this afternoon. What I was thinking is that I personally would like to be careful with the term, this concept of trauma, and not saying that everything is trauma and every literary space is a space for expressing or saying or living, experiencing trauma. But what I was thinking is that maybe while you were speaking, Zohar, you were talking about the question of the therapist, right, who is influenced by what he is listening, by the narrative that he heard, and how this narrative actually can teach us about the therapist. And I think that literature, of course, is not representation of reality, but for sure, one of the things that are important, for me at least, in literature, that through literature we understand better the reality from where it emerged. And yes. So that was a kind of thought that I had that maybe can also help us to go a little bit further.
Very briefly, I am very reluctant to the essentialization of literature that I heard from you, Marcus. I think your conception is a very contemporary, restricted one. It's very difficult for me to hear dogma like literature is not representation. Some Aristotle wrote about mimesis or something like that. And I think that literature and specialists of literature has to be more modest, because trauma is a serious thing. Not everything is trauma. I'm very reluctant to see essential connection between every literature, every literary discourse, and trauma, rhyme and trauma, pastoral And trauma, I think trauma here is taken in a very loose sense, and I disagree with this perspective. Excuse me, my English is not so good, so I'm too rough.
Thank you. I just wanted to defend you in a way. So here we have a split here. We have the people talking about literature analysis and understanding literature as literature, and then they have the other group taking literature to a certain extent as some giving information about reality. Perhaps it's better to understand. One can better understand the problem if you just take into account that in the 19th century, literature tried to produce, to look for truth. Looking for truth was an idea of imitatio naturae, to copy nature. But even in the 19th century, every author knew they are not able to do so. And the 19th century, there was a certain development into modernity, which was, to put it in a sort of like a sloppy way, come on, let's break up the forms, let's break up all the rules, and we would use literature to produce genuine experiences, new experiences, which are not part of our society, but at the same time they tell us something about society, about our life, about being humans. Let's talk about problems, conflicts, and so on and so forth. And that's exactly one of these books, using elements of the world, society, conflicts, discourses, and putting them new together to produce something new. Show ruptures, show alternative interpretations, provoke alternative interpretations. And that's generally one of the main techniques of European literature for the last 100 years. And that's one of the main goals of literature. In spite of that, there is, of course, some broad this literary discourse which produces comments on reality, trying to talk about reality. And the classical testimony texts are trying to do that, but that's a literature text, a pure literary text, doing exactly the opposite, trying to be a literary text. So we have here two different kind of texts and text understandings we have to deal with. I think that's the problem we are having at the moment. Someone asks, saying, I want a text talking about reality. Here's a text. This text wants to be literature, producing genuinely literary experiences about life in its complicated pattern in a way. So that's the question we have. That is avant-garde in a way, and that's some classical idea of imitatio naturae. That's my idea.
I do have something to add now, residue. It's also a clinical remark, which means for me that it is at the same time literary. Psychology may have evolved since Freud. Psychoanalysis is not completed its return to Freud. The clinic testifies to this vocal testimony every day. Psychoanalysis has not completed its return to Freud, including to the precising of Freudian texts, and including the concept of Aktualtrauma and Nachtraglichkeit, which we talked about. With every literary text, with every analytic session, which is a miniature of an analysis, testifies to, attests to, which is a different thing from testimony, as I said, in its particularity, every day. And the experience of, as Marcus said, teaching literature is part of what can help us precise it. And about the citations that you mentioned of Freud, Lacan, in literary criticism, I don't want to make a generalization, but so I'll just testify to my particular experience of it. Very often there are quotes that are lifted out of context, inserted into a different discourse. To me, in that sense, you can put the name Freud and Lacan on them. They have nothing to do with psychoanalysis. With literature, I don't know.
I would just briefly say something because I mean I've been asked somehow, so well, to be more modest, yeah. I mean I like this being called no. It's not. I'm not taking this personally or psychologically. I think it's important because it goes into the same direction, also this direction. I think the teaching of literature. You would call this now dogmatic, but I think that the teaching of literature is something very minimalistic. It's something very modest. It's something very specific. It is something that has to do with the encounter of that layer of language which escapes basically all the other discourses. This is the specificity, not of literature. It is not the object literature. It is the specificity of this activity of teaching literature. I think teaching literature is a specific activity which is not representing something that would be there without that being taught. I think there is no objectivity in literature. It's an activity that involves fundamentally the institution, the pressure of the society on this institution. It's not coincidence that all these things are put into question. It involves all these other things. And with psychoanalysis, it's the same. In a certain way, it is the same. Call it essentializing. I don't know. Yeah, I would. Essence is. Is a good term, as good as mimesis, which is not representation, I think. But I mean that's a debate among literary critics. It's a long debate. It started with Aristotle. Okay, just.
I would like to highlight the particular privilege of having an interdisciplinary discourse. First, yes, the Actualnie Rosen were the ones that we were talking about, Freud left behind. I mean, it's so refreshing to hear Kel Kidron do the ethnographic work and comparing the Cambodian to the Holocaust second generation. And I think it's in this field work which reaches empirical levels that you really can glean and also detail in nuance what the trauma and the transmission of trauma is by definitely taking into account the particular culture. Equally, it's refreshing to hear a historian speak about novels, and the sort of crossing of boundaries and Huri and Shalamov and Shakespeare's plays. I think they're wonderful playgrounds, so to speak, for understanding trauma and ways of dealing with trauma, or being quite rigid about it, or more flexible, can see the mechanism the way. And I go much further. About literature, I definitely think we need that creativity and this flexibility of in order to understand, to allow for borders to open, for boundaries to open, for addresses to take place. It's not an accident in comparative literature. There's so much written about trauma. And last but not least, if this is can be, I would like to leave you with an image that is Gabriella's dream in Dan Lamier's presentation. The all head and no body, and taking in water, and the presence of the little girl. The little girl is an equal, is a companion. It's not the overpowering, intrusive mother, and that is how the body grows.
I think maybe one last, please.
You wanted to?
Okay.
Okay, Stu.
Thank you. If I may, I think from a bystander, because I still consider myself a bystander, that's like an ethical position of mine. As a bystander, I feel this is a very healthy debate, as it is a debate about who owns which concept. or which field. No, I'm just saying. And that it seems to me that on the most basic level, especially in a conference like this, the basic appeal is the same, is listen. Is be sensitive and listen and acknowledge another person's pain. And whether that's done through literary studies or through sociology or through whichever your tool may be, the appeal, the intent is the same. So I feel like the naming game is not as interesting as trying to understand how other people feel. That's my opinion. They shut down everything.
That was great. I like. Hello?
Both of you.
We can hear you.
Hello? Okay. I like what Ron said. I would say that I agree with Dory about the promise of a multidisciplinary dialogue. I've been a part of many, and the ones that have worked when people have stopped having these internal dialogues and internal fights and stopped talking to each other and started thinking about how they're going to move forward towards something new rather than fight the old battles. There are different potentials for something new, but I think that have been raised in this conversation so far. Whether it's pain of others, whether it's social suffering, whatever you want to call it, I think that if we could articulate something like that to move forward with, this would be helpful rather than fighting all the old battles, what we're turning out. And I think that I know that the theoreticians will raise questions anytime the word real is used and privilege, but for me it starts with suffering, pain, injustice, loss, public health, social injustice concepts or realities that have to be placed at the center. Like the guy you met on the street.
Yeah. Thank you very much. The chairs. Thank you.